Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, everybody, to your second to last flip. Am I right? It's crazy. I know. It's absolutely insane. But let's go ahead and dive headfirst into where we left off because I don't want your second to last flip to be your longest flip of the year. Am I right? So now the big thing about it is, though, is y'all are doing a great job. A lot of y'all are really understanding what's going on about the whole Great Depression thing, 1929, the stock market crash. Grace DeVeers had a lot of questions on how money just disappears, which I think was a really good line of questions that we had in G period today. But the big thing is, though, is we left off talking about like the high unemployment rates that are occurring in Germany. By 1933, like 30% of the German men are going to be unemployed. Women are going to be more likely to keep their jobs, and we left off on this concept of the increased amount of fractured masculinity, right? So what we're getting into right now is I know that in my D period, like Gabby LeBlanc's like, oh, so he's taking advantage of them when they're at their lowest, right? And that's a big thing, right? We're going to be analyzing how these leaders like Mussolini and Hitler are going to be able to convince men to join up in their organizations, go forth and be terrible and enact their awful, evil works, right? So the Great Depression, which is going to last from 1930 to 1939, is going to fuel the rise of these totalitarian dictators, right? It's going to fuel, I don't want to download the new software, leave me alone. All right, so like, it's going to fuel the rise of these totalitarian dictators, right? Particularly your fascist ones. Stalin's a little bit of a different situation we'll talk about here. We'll talk about him here in a little bit, but the big thing about it going forward is you got to understand that these men are going to prey upon the weakened state of their countries, right? They are going to prey directly upon the weakened state of their countries and directly go after these young men in a way to try and actually fuel their own power and growth, right? So the biggest thing is, though, is like how, right? And so the idea is, ignore this. This is from a couple of years ago, but their big idea is they're going to restore their masculinity, right? And it all starts off with the creation of these things known as paramilitary groups, right? What paramilitary or para means is like partial or somewhat, right? So a paramilitary group is the idea that it's not a military group that wasn't created by a country in a sense, right? So a military group like the American Army, the American Air Force is directly recruited by the American government and directly paid by the American government and also directly regulated by the American government, right? Every country, most countries anyway, have military branches, but the thing about it is these military groups, the brown shirts, the black shirts, the Italian black shirts, are going to be created directly by these fascist organizers. For example, this right here is a picture of the Nazi brown shirts during the late 1920s going into the 1930s, and who is standing, of course, directly right here in the middle? That is Adolf Hitler, right? And then, of course, here is a picture of the SS, or the actual black shirts is what they're referred to as. That is Hitler right there marching and actually demonstrating his power along with them. And then also there is like the Italian black shirts, who are going to be the same guys that in 1929, which I know Michaela Schmidt knows about because she knows that Mussolini installed himself and demanded to be prime minister. That's right, Michaela. I started reading that doc that she shared with me. But the big thing about it, though, in the long run is that these guys are going to march down the streets of Rome and demand that their leader, Benito Mussolini, be enacted as the new prime minister of Italy. Well, the thing about it is that did not just stop there, right? It doesn't just stop at the idea that they're going around and demanding things. They're also roaming the streets as an unofficial fake military recruited by people like Hitler and Mussolini to intimidate politicians, physically assault minorities, and also do things like this thing called making them drink castor oil, right? Castor oil, when imbibed by a person, leads you to have violent, nauseous movements, vomit, and actually to be in an extreme amount of pain, right? So what is happening is they're directly assaulting people that they do not like. And as of 1933, when Hitler was commanding the German government, because by 1933 he is elected chancellor, and then is actually going to there's a law that's going to be passed called the Enabling Act, where he basically has the combined positions of the president of Germany and the chancellor combined together, and he becomes what's known as Der Führer, spelled D-E-R-F-U-H-R-E-R, the title that he ends up earning, which means the leader, right? His paramilitary groups were becoming even more violent and beginning to enact even more horrible things on even more people, right? Well, that's the thing, though, okay? Speaking of enacting these horrible things, big thing about it is if you have these creepy military groups that were created by Hitler and Mussolini, the black shirts, the brown shirts, things like that, then you must need to give them an enemy to fight, right? This is a big element about restoring that masculinity, giving them someone to directly blame for the hardships that are going on in their economies. Now, the thing about it is the Nazis and the Italian black shirts had their paramilitary groups turned loose, and they would violently attack communists, Jewish communities, and also other minorities, right? The Nuremberg laws is an example of this growing, disgusting leadership during the 1930s and the Great Depression, right? Because we know the Great Depression lasts from 1930 to 1939, characterized by unprecedentedly high unemployment. Well, the Nuremberg laws are going to come out right after Hitler becomes the Führer of Germany, right? And the Nuremberg laws are a set of laws that came out in 1935 that defined German Aryans, right? Or people that were in line with the original master race of Germans, going all the way back to pre-Middle Ages, of these people that Hitler believed had blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, it's a common myth that he wanted to create a race of people that were blonde hair and blue eyes. That's actually not true, because he himself was brown hair and brown eyes. He believed that the Aryans were the original race of Scandinavian and German people that were considered this like perfect group, right? And so what he decided to do was use the Nuremberg laws to segregate Jewish people and undesirables who were far away from that ideal, right? And so the Nuremberg laws began to codify and quantify who was actually of direct German descent and who was considered Jewish, or who was considered unworthy of the new government that was actually on the rise inside of Germany, right? And another big event that's going to happen that is like known as creating those enemies is this event known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, right? So in 1938, during the Great Depression, Kristallnacht is a massive event where the paramilitary groups of the SS and the Brown Shirts are going to be set loose on a Jewish neighborhood, and they're going to go in and destroy everything, right? Kristallnacht was a major event in the rise of the Holocaust because it demonstrated how German people had been convinced by people like Hitler that it was not their fault that these terrible things were happening to them, that it was people like the Jewish community, which is the dumbest thing on the planet and doesn't make any sense, but it's because Hitler was taking advantage of them when the unemployment rate was at the highest it had ever been, etc., etc. Now, the thing about it is Kristallnacht actually happened, and that picture that I just showed you right here is actually a destroyed Jewish synagogue because a young Jewish boy actually shot a Nazi officer, a Nazi black shirt officer, because he was harassing his father, right? So the Nazi officer was harassing the Jewish boy's father, a shopkeeper and a shop owner, and what ends up happening is, after that moment happens, they go out and they kill this young man who shot that Nazi officer, but they also proceed to ransack the entire Jewish community inside many major German cities, and that's why it's referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, right? Because so many Jewish businesses had the front windows destroyed, were completely raided and broken into, completely stolen from and robbed, right? It is a disgusting event that characterizes the growth of this enemy creation by people like Adolf Hitler, right? And Hitler's goal in this entire thing was creating an idea that he believed was known as his Volksgemeinschaft, also known as the people's community, right? As in a group of German people that are free from Slavic people, any minorities that they don't like, and is also free from the Jewish community as well, because he wants to create this pure German race, because he's a racist, eugenicist piece of crap, right? So now look, in the long run though, as well as in 1938, the Italian racial laws are going to come out, just so you know that this is not only happening in Nazi Germany, it's actually also happening in fascist Italy, right? So going forward, another big thing that Hitler and his buddies are going to do is they're going to directly reduce the rights of women, okay? Now going into this so you understand, women, remember, were actually keeping their jobs, mostly in the Great Depression. They were actually retaining a lot of their positions. Well, what Mussolini and Hitler decided to do in the fascist Italian and fascist German government is they want to create where it's only servile positions for women, where they believe that their only place was at home, to force a woman to depend on the wages of men, right? For example, right here, this is a actual German poster that directly represents that. Notice the woman right here is holding a baby and is not actually having tools in her hand or weapons whatsoever. And Frauenwarte, or Warte in German, actually is a way to say work, right? And so when it's directly translated, Frauenwarte literally means the idea of women wait, right? So women wait. So Frauenwarte means women are waiting instead of being outside working where the men are supposed to be. What a ridiculous concept. Do you see what I mean by that restoring their masculinity concept? The idea that women should wait for the men to do the jobs for them because all he wants to do is restore that masculinity to them, right? And he wants these women to be dependent on wages from their husbands. This right here is another very, very similar piece of piece of propaganda that came out in the Italian fascist government that shows a mother holding a child and they're only there to bear the future race of fascists inside of Italy, which is absolutely ridiculous, but he directly wanted to reduce the rights of women. Another big thing as well, promising them work, right? So Hitler, when he comes into power, directly throws the German government into further debt by creating these new groups that are actually going to put these men that are now out of work to work. He wants to employ these men in paramilitary groups, right? He wants to employ them in the different labor services where they're going to actually create fascist architecture, like this Italian fascist architecture. You can actually tell that's fascist architecture because it's directly harkening back to Rome. It's got all the old Roman like scenery in it and stuff like that. And then also it's shaped like an ancient Roman or Greek hippodrome, right? So now the other big thing about it is this right here is the Nazi workforce, right? And so the big thing about it is, as you can see, this causes massive debt for Hitler's government, yes, but Hitler is promising to make the money back in future conquests. Now, this is a very disgusting thing about Hitler's rise to power as well as Mussolini's rise to power. They directly created government-funded working organizations that put men to work, right? So this right here is another image of the actual Nazi workforce, and they were being told to drill and march, but not holding a weapon, holding a shovel, right? And the idea is that by putting these men to work and giving them wages so they can go home and actually be the breadwinner in their home again, the idea would be that you're creating a loyal workforce to a cause as well. And that right there is Hitler, of course, shoveling dirt, acting like he's working right there along with his men. It's absolutely stupid and disgusting because what is going on is Mussolini and Hitler are playing these people. They are literally indoctrinating them to believe that they are there as their savior when they actually are there as their destructor because they're evil pieces of junk. Now, going into it, speaking of indoctrination, they also indoctrinated the youth, right? They created youth organizations to teach hateful ideologies at a very young age. This right here is an image of the Hitler Youth that literally was used as the Nazi youth, where they literally trained young men in how to basically be future soldiers and how to basically be racist, to be anti-Semitic, to be disgustingly nasty to other parts of their community, and to believe in Hitler's goals. Because who are the most susceptible people to terrible ideas? That of young children. This right here is the Italian fascist youth, created by Mussolini in his country as well. It's absolutely disgusting that these things were going on, and we have so many artifacts from these things as well. For example, all of these young men were given knives to mark their entrance into the Hitler Youth Organization, right? So going forward even further, the biggest thing you have to understand is that there were even other methods as well, like propaganda, for example, right? The big thing about it is I don't know if this is still here or not, but the big thing was that there was this video that was made. Yep, it's okay. Well, I'll clip it in later. We'll talk about it later on. But there was a massive video made by Hitler that was shown in so many areas known as the Triumph of the Will. And we'll look at it in class and stuff like that and talk about it a little bit further. But I'm a little bit annoyed that, of course, the YouTube license expired. But it is what it is. So this entire propaganda film was actually shown to different Germans and also to different people in the German growing German idea and area, as well as to recruit future Nazis, showing Hitler as this great person when in reality he was absolutely disgusting, right? It's a video of him yelling and screaming at this massive stage. His face is getting beet red and stuff like that. But like I said, we'll look at it a little bit in class and things like that. There was also this thing known as the People's Radio, right? The People's Radio, or the Volksempfänger, would literally meant the idea of a cheap radio that could be put into the homes of German people and actually directly pipe in Hitler's ideas into their houses, right? So, also another big thing as well is negative propaganda. This right here is a book burning, right? Nazis would hold book burnings and actually burn certain texts and books where they believed that they believed did not represent the German people in a manner that they so chose. For example, my favorite book that I've ever read was burned at this book burning. The one pictured right here, the book flying through the air right there, is a book known as All Quiet on the Western Front, which my honors kids are currently reading in our class, and we love the story about Paul and his friends, and we understand that it's making war look bad, because war is bad, right? But Hitler believed that you needed to destroy those texts because it's going to lead to a negative image of the country of Germany, because remember, the fascist playbook is all about making the country look better than the individual, right? And in the long run, you always know fascism's on the rise when people start banning and destroying books, right? Because it's like limiting the amount of ideas that go in and out of people's minds. Same thing too as well was this creepy radio that like Hitler would have sold to people. Another big thing as well is holidays and vacations, right? There was this really intense program that was started by the Nazis known as the Strength Through Joy campaign, because he believed that if he gave German people happy experiences or happy things, that it would keep them believing in everything he was saying, right? Even though it would go against their rational mind to think that it was like anybody in the Jewish community's fault that they had lost World War I. He didn't care, because he believed that if we give them these creepy dance aerobic classes, or if we give them a vacation, which literally when you went on vacations in different areas of Nazi Germany, you like earned pins to collect and stuff like that, give them vacations and holidays, or make a car for them that's very, very affordable. That right there, of course, is the Volkswagen, right? Like the idea of like creating a car that's cheap for them to afford is going to create party membership. And he, like I said, he's taking advantage of them at their absolute lowest, which is absolutely disgusting, right? So those are methods on how fascist organizations are going to recruit membership in Italy and in Germany. So that's in Italy and Germany, though. But what about over in Russia? Or not known as Russia anymore, known as the Soviet Union. The guy who is leading over them is not a fascist dictator, but a communist dictator. And his name is Joseph Stalin, right? Stalin is going to take a dramatically different approach when it comes to creating a loyal audience of people underneath him, right? Well, first and foremost, you should know Joseph Stalin, because first and foremost, that's not even his actual real name. Joseph Stalin's real name was Losif Dazhgashvili, right? And this right here is him pictured as a very, very young man. Losif Dazhgashvili wasn't even born in Russia. He was born in Georgia. Not Georgia the state, but Georgia the country in Europe, right? So Losif here is going to rise through the actual Communist Party ranks, through the Red Guard as well, and is going to be right alongside Vladimir Lenin when he comes to power. The big thing about it that you need to understand is that why would we call a man named Losif Joseph Stalin if that's not his real name? Well, the thing about it is Joseph Stalin changed his name to Joseph Stalin because Stalin means the man of steel, right? So like he literally had these ideas that he wanted to create a giant industrialized Russia that would compete with the rest of the continent and bring glory and money and funds to Russia, even though they're a communist government. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But what had happened was, in the long run, is that basically, in a nutshell, a newspaper writer called him, oh, Joseph, the man of steel. So he literally changed his name to it because he was that arrogant, right? But where he comes from originally is he was originally a part of Lenin's inner circle. Remember Vladimir Lenin back in the day? This guy right here that led the communist takeover of Russia and actually led them during their Bolshevik revolution and stuff? Well, flanked on him on either side are two very important people. That right there is the dude that we've already talked about before, Leon Trotsky. And this guy right here, that's Joseph Stalin, right? So Joseph Stalin was a part of that inner circle along with Leon Trotsky when they were actually beginning to grow the ideas of Russia and the USSR following the successful installing of Lenin in 1922. However, Lenin is going to die in 1924. So Lenin comes to power officially in 1918, give or take, 1918, 1917, survives all the way up until 1924. And when he dies, what ends up happening is Stalin and Trotsky are left together trying to vie for this power vacuum, right? So the power vacuum that was left behind by Lenin, Stalin and Trotsky begin to argue and bicker over who is going to get to actually take party membership and become the party leader, right? So the thing about it is, though, is Stalin turns on Trotsky and his allies and begins a massive campaign in trying to convince Bolsheviks that Trotsky actually has a terrible idea of trying to spread socialism to huge areas and swaths of land. But what ends up happening is Stalin successfully runs Trotsky out of Russia. Trotsky ends up running away to Mexico, where later on, Trotsky would be assassinated by a man that Stalin sent to Mexico to kill him, right? He actually gets an ice axe to the face, right? So now, what ends up happening, though, is when Stalin comes to power in 1924/19 going up to 1928, he decides that he wants to attack two major issues that are going on in Russia: unemployment and famine, right? He wants to attack those two issues by actually fixing them, and he believes he will be able to create himself as the premier of Russia and a leader that everybody is going to want to be underneath. So the famine one is the one we're going to start with, right? So famine, first and foremost, so you know what it is he's going to actually be going through some problems because he has to collectivize the agriculture of Russia, and he has to figure out a way to make it so his farms are state-owned, right? So the thing about it is what ends up happening is he decides to demonize a group of people known as kulaks, right? So when Stalin comes to power, he wants to go away from Lenin's original NEP program, which is also known as the New Economic Policy, that is going to mix capitalist and communist ideas together. And what Stalin wants to do is he wants to create massive farms that are owned by the government, right? By the Russian government or the Soviet government, and that they would have workers on them that would actually contribute to growing and making all of the food and products, and that those would be then sent to state distribution areas where it would be redistributed amongst the population. He believes the best way to do this is by demonizing a group of people known as kulaks, right? Kulaks is Russian for the word fist, right? What a kulak is a middle class farmer, right? Now, Stalin demonized this group of people because he believed that it was their fault for actually holding on to all of the goods of Russia. That's why they're called fist, right? Because it was the idea that they're holding on to all the goods of Russia inside of their enclosed hand. Now, keep in mind, Lenin hated these kulaks as well, but Stalin wanted to actually basically purge them out and have a huge amount of them executed, which he did. Hundreds of thousands of kulaks who actually lived originally in the place that you now know as modern-day Ukraine were completely arrested and then executed in a huge purge. But the big backfire that ironically happened was that the famine got much worse, and 10 million people died as a result of the famine and the purging of the kulaks, right? So you would say, hey, Stalin, your idea about purging out these people you call kulaks seems like it might have been a bad idea because now even more people are out of food and you have millions of people starving. But what ends up going down is Stalin refuses to take blame for this and decides to purge his government and blame it on them. He blames his own Bolshevik party members for the plan itself and begins opening these things known as the gulags, right? What a gulag is basically a Russian work camp in Siberia. And he begins to blame the men that were around him the entire time that helped him come up with the ideas of demonizing the kulaks and has them sent to these Russian work camps where people are dying at alarmingly high rates from starvation and frostbite and freezing to death, right? And you can tell that this actually was happening under Stalin's Great Purge movement because these pictures right here. This right here is the original photograph, right? Men around him were the ones that were on board with his idea of taking land, money, and food away from these people known as the kulaks, right? And so they were on board with this entire concept. Now, the thing that ends up happening, though, in the long run, is that you have to understand that when this goes south and a famine that actually gets worse and millions more people die, he begins to blame the men that were around him when he came up with this idea. And so as you can see, this is the original picture. Then this picture came out about a year later. What happened to this guy? Oh, he was sent to the Gulag in the Great Purge, right? What happened to this guy? Because he's not in this picture anymore. He was photoshopped out. Oh, he was sent to the Gulag in the Great Purge, right? This guy also sent. So by the end of the whole thing, it's just a picture of Stalin by himself, right? That's a very big representation of his Great Purge. Now, going forward, though, what about that unemployment thing? He wanted to hyper-industrialize. So Stalin comes to power by hyper-industrializing in his idea known as the 5-year plan, right? He wants to create massive factories with huge cities around them, right? Now, the crazy thing about it is his idea to purge the kulaks and take over their land and create those state-owned farms was a miserable failure that he ended up blaming on his own party, right? But this one was actually kind of successful, right? He ends up building huge factories throughout Russia. One that was in Stalingrad, a city in Russia, where they had a tractor plant. One was in this place called Magnitogorsk, which had a huge steel plant. And another one was in this place called Ural, which had these huge coal mines in it, right? So the thing about it is, in the long run, he would then build cities around those factories and employ massive numbers of workers. This is going to increase the industrial output of Russia by over 150%, right? Which is wildly ridiculous. Even though there were downfalls of the 5-year plan, they still weren't as bad as the idea of the collectivization of agriculture, as we know, did not work, right? So also the thing about it is a big part of it is he believed he was getting a lot of free labor from these gulags, right? So there's one last little thing we got to talk about, and it's what's going on in Japan. So the thing about it, though, is last but not least, You got Stalin doing the 5-year plan and the persecuting of the kulaks in Russia, right? You then, in Japan, though, have something also very interesting going on, right? So Japan is going to begin to invade the northern region of China, known as Manchuria, in 1931, mainly for its national resources and to supply their new factories. No declaration of war was ever issued, and you had a violating of the League of Nations rules. So Japan is going to leave the League of Nations and keep invading China, which is going to happen in this thing known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. It's going to last from 1937 to 1945, and the big thing about it that you have to understand is their two leaders, okay? The God Emperor guy known as Hirohito, and their war minister known as Hideki Tojo. So what you've got going on in Germany is the growth of fascist organizations. You also have that going on in Italy. What you have going on in Russia is the growth of a communist dictator who is killing not only middle-class farmers, but then also his own party members and leading to famine, and then also hyper-industrializing the country as fast as he humanly can. Then you have in Japan the direct invasion of China by Japan under their God Emperor Hirohito, which was extremely a young man at the time, and their war minister, a man by the name of Hideki Tojo, who ends up becoming president of Japan. And that's going to lead to this thing known as the Massacre of Nanjing. And in 1937, the Japanese military is going to kill anywhere, from what we understand, from 40,000 to 300,000 innocent civilians as they tried to invade the eastern reaches of China. So everything is basically upside down right now. You have dictators rising to power in Europe. You've got... I will call you back, sweetheart. You have dictators rising to power in Europe. You have a dictator rising to power in Russia. And you also have a massive, disgusting invasion of China by Japan. So the world is turning upside down. And we haven't even started World War II yet. But we'll talk about all this stuff when I see y'all back in class. Y'all have a great weekend. I'll see y'all soon.